Well, good morning again, and welcome to the College of Humanities and Social Sciences Conference. I'm really happy to welcome you to our keynote session. And before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the help and support of the William Paterson University Alumni Association, who have generously supported this conference. I'd also like to recognize Dr. Kara Rabbit, Dean of the College, who is here. Kara, if you'd like to stand and be acknowledged. And also the presence of Dr. John Paris, Faculty Senate Chair. John, thank you for being here. And before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I would like to invite all our students and faculty, all our community, to the debate watch party, which will take place on Monday on the occasion of the last presidential debate of this campaign. So join us for the debate, for lively discussion, and pizza between 8:30 and 10 p.m. in the Chang Library Auditorium. So it is really a pleasure and a privilege for me to introduce our keynote speaker, but at the same time, it's a great challenge. You know, as a professor of language, I sometimes ask my students to read a fairly lengthy text and to condense it into a few paragraphs. And they look at me and they say, geez, professor, you must be kidding. This is a mile long. And when I looked at Dr. Martin Alcoff's bio, I looked at it and I said, geez, professor, you must be kidding. This is 5 miles long. So anyway, I shall do my best and introduce our guest today. Dr. Linda Martin Alcoff is professor of philosophy at Hunter College and the CUNY Graduate Center. Dr. Martin Alcoff has degrees from Georgia State University and Brown University and has held positions at Syracuse University, SUNY Stony Brook, and Kalamazoo College. She also has visiting appointments at Cornell, at Brown, and at the University of Aarhus. Dr. Martin Alcoff's writings have focused on social identity and race, epistemology and politics, sexual violence, Foucault, and Latino issues in philosophy. She has written 2 books, Visible Identities, Race, Gender, and the Self, which won the Frantz Fanon Award in 2009. Her other book is Real Knowing, New Versions of the Coherence Theory. Dr. Martin Alcoff has, in addition, edited or co-edited 10 more books, including Feminist Epistemologies, Thinking from the Underside of History, Epistemology, The Big Questions, Identities, Singing in the Fire, Tales of Women in Philosophy, The Blackwell Guide to Feminist Philosophy, Identity Politics Reconsidered, Constructing the Nation, A Race and Nationalism Reader, St. Paul Among the Philosophers, Feminism, Sexuality, and the Return of Religion. She is currently at work on 2 new books, one on sexual violence, and one an account of the future of white identity. Also forthcoming is another co-edited anthology on the politics of love. Dr. Martin Alcoff is co-editor of Hypatia, a journal of feminist philosophy. She has held numerous distinguished fellowships and was named one of Syracuse University's first Meredith Professors for Teaching Excellence. Dr. Martin Alcoff is president of the American Philosophical Association Eastern Division and has also served on several of its committees. She was also named the Distinguished Woman in Philosophy for 2005 by the Society for Women in Philosophy. And in 2006, she was named one of the 100 most influential Hispanics in the United States. So you see, this task was really not easy. And I have not even mentioned the more than 100 essays, articles, introductions to books, dictionary and encyclopedia articles, invited chapters, book reviews that have been authored by Dr. Alcoff and that have appeared in the most highly respected publications. So a certain presidential hopeful told the nation a few days ago that he had to work really hard to find qualified women to fill positions in his cabinet. And perhaps he didn't know where to look. He should have asked us, because when we were looking for a qualified candidate to deliver our keynote, we knew exactly where to look. And instead of a binder full of women, we are proud to present you with someone who all by herself will fill several binders. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr. Linda Martin Alcoff.
Thank you so much. Those kind of introductions make me nervous. But I'm really happy to be here with my friends, Stephen Thompson and Barbara Andrew and Howard McGarry, who's also here for just today, but people whose work I've learned from so much over the years. And I'm happy to be here today to talk about the election. I do believe in the importance of electoral work and voting, but I think that it's only part of a larger strategy of bringing about democracy. I think we should think about work in the electoral arena as a means to an end and not an end in itself. But I do think it's a good means, because in the election, I mean, I'm sure some of you have been paying attention to it. It's been going on for like 2 years now. It's like finally coming to an end. It's an opportunity for a kind of national public conversation on issues. It's an opportunity to expand the agenda of issues, and it's also a way in which we can cultivate the organizational level and the skill level in varied communities. So I support the electoral arena as a means to an end of enlarging democracy. And I have been watching the debate. Have some of you been watching the debates? I have to confess, I did have a drinking party at my apartment for the first debate. It's easy to have those in Brooklyn because nobody drives in Brooklyn. So we had some people over, and I told them, if you wanted to stay sober, your word was poverty. And if you wanted to get a little tipsy, your word was middle class. And if you really wanted to lose it, your word was taxes. And that really worked. So the grandiose words that have been put on today's discussion, democracy, justice, and equality, are not big words in the debate. And they can often seem like more like political footballs than real goals in especially the electoral arena. But it is true that democracy is considered by most people, not all people, most people as the most just form of society. And a real and effective democracy clearly requires political equality between citizens. Our capacity to meaningfully participate in civil and political life of our communities requires that that it's possible for us to go into the public arena and be taken seriously, that we have the wherewithal to speak up, that we have the time to become informed and involved. We're not working 2 jobs or 3 jobs. And that we can rely on basic protections of our rights to participate, our rights to vote. So I think here is where the issue of race enters in, that I want to talk about today. And I want to approach the issue of race in a real world sense, in the sense that some political theorists call non-ideal theory rather than ideal theory. I mean, when we talk about, ideal notions of justice, we might think like Justice Roberts, that to end discrimination, you simply end discrimination on the basis of race. So we might assert that race should be ideally politically irrelevant, right? We shouldn't take it into account. But in reality, we know that in the here and now, as Obama and Romney spar in the national election, race is not irrelevant. There's a sizable gap in unemployment, incarceration, rates of foreclosure, inherited wealth, police brutality, and being the target of voter suppression. The gap between racial representations in the Republican versus the Democratic conventions, if you watched any of the conventions, it was visually dramatic, and that made the issue of race visually obvious. The numbers in the polls do as well. Close to 0% of African Americans plan to vote for Romney. Roughly 53% of whites do. So I want to make first 3 points in this regard. and then get to my main discussion. The first point is that there's a noticeable gap in who is talking overtly about race in this election. In 2008, we were inundated by a rhetoric of post-racialism that held that Obama's very nomination meant that we no longer need to talk about race. Racism has subsided, this argument went, so we don't need to address it. And here's two further examples. In November 2010, 2 years ago, when the Republicans swept the House and locked in Congress a bare 2 years after Obama's historic win, and after a summer of Tea Party action and demonstrations at public meetings on health care. So right after the election, the week after the election when the Republicans won, the New York Times ran a front page article assessing 4 possible explanations for the Republican victory. 4 hypotheses that might explain the Republican victory. Not one of them concerned in any way race. The racial references of the Tea Party attacks on Obama that had happened all that summer went unmentioned. Second example, just last week, Columbia University professor of humanities Mark Lilla wrote a critical review in the New York Times of this new book by this conservative guy, Charles Kessler. The name of Kessler's book is I Am the Change, Barack Obama and the Crisis of Liberalism. And what Kessler is trying to do in this book is explain the reasoned arguments about why conservatives dislike and distrust Obama so much. In that book, Kessler scrupulously avoids the issue of race. So none of the reasons that conservatives have to dislike Obama have anything to do with race, according to him. But surprisingly, so does the liberal Mark Lilla, who offers no real response to Kessler's explanations of the conservative animosity toward Obama, other than to show how they're based more on myths about Obama's record than the facts. So I would suggest that in most of the mainstream media, neither conservatives nor liberals are exploring the way in which race is an important factor in this election as well as other elections. By contrast, on the extreme right, race is very much mentioned. Obama effigies have been lynched in Republican headquarters. Romney supporters have made T-shirts recently that say, "Put white back in the White House." Obama has been called, as we know, the son of a Kenyan terrorist, a Muslim socialist. 2 weeks ago, Newt Gingrich was interviewed discussing, some of you may have seen this, you can look it up on YouTube. Newt Gingrich discusses Obama's strange rhythm and laziness and need to play basketball. Within 2 years after the election of Obama in 2008, the number of hate groups in the United States increased to over 900. Anti-government or so-called patriot groups tripled to 1,200. And nativist extremist groups of the kind that harass immigrants engaging in what they call beaner hunting saw the largest increase after the last presidential election, an 80% increase to a total of 1,600. And don't assume you know where all these groups are. While there are 32 hate groups in Alabama, there are 31 in New York State, 44 in New Jersey, and 60 in California. And don't assume these groups are harmless. The month that Obama was elected, in November 2008, gun sales reached an all-record high of 1.5 million. So my first point here is that we all need to talk about race and not leave it to the extremists. Second point I want to make is that I do want to concede something to the post-racialists. Torre, this interesting analyst, Torre, wrote a book after 2008 called Who's Afraid of Post-Blackness? But what he meant by post-blackness was a very different sense than the idea that race no longer counts. Torre's claim was that after 2008, many more people began to understand that blackness is not the same for all. The pollsters and the political analysts discovered in that election that not all black people had the same demands of Obama or the same questions, given differences of class, immigration status, nation of origin, whether they were rural or urban folks, and so on. Some African Americans were very angry that Obama broke his ties with his pastor, Jeremiah Wright, you might recall. Not all were. Some were angry about his Bill Cosby turn to chastise fathers during that election. Not all were. Such political and social differences became apparent also for other groups. And I think it was interesting to watch the 2008 election because you could see the pundits and the news analysts kind of mature in their understanding about how things work in this country. They discovered that it was not possible to talk about the white vote or to predict the white vote or to analyze the reasons for the white vote, because in that election, white voters were split by whether they were in a union or non-union household, whether they were rural or urban, and whether they were female. So if you took gender, if you took whether they were rural or urban, and if you took whether they were in a union household, then you could get a prediction. You could get a reliable prediction about how those white folks would vote. But you couldn't get a prediction by just talking about how white folks in general would vote, and that's certainly true with other groups as well. Today, the white vote is again significantly split. Older rural whites are firm for Romney. The latest polls I've seen are about a month ago, but I don't think they've changed. Other whites are not. So we need to talk about race, but we need to learn to talk about it in more complex ways that understand that it's mediated by other variables. You still cannot factor out race if you just talk about older people, for example, without taking into account race among other variables. You're not going to get any useful data. You're not going to get any useful predictions. So that's my second point. Third point to make, and this is connected. Elections and behavior in general is not just about rational utility calculations involving our economic interests. In particular, we need to explore the domain of our emotions, our feelings, and the way that our feelings respond to particular kinds of prompts. And a lot of theorists even in political science, but certainly in philosophy and other fields, are beginning to explore, and in sociology, are beginning to explore this topic they call public feeling, what some call affect theory. Rather than predict votes by rational choice theory applied to interest group politics, they argue we need to pay more attention to the feelings that are evoked by candidates like choice of rhetorical language or style. And this isn't the dog whistle idea. The dog whistle idea is that there's coded messages that are sent to the faithful through subtle word choice. Rather, this is the idea that feelings themselves can be mobilized to affect behavioral choices by giving people new ideas about who is their ally and who is their enemy, and what the payoff of a particular policy agenda will be on their emotional well-being, their sense of pride and importance and value in their communities and even in the larger world. I have felt that these affective or emotional responses were particularly on display in reaction to the debates. All the talk has been, after the debates, about body language, assertiveness, facial expressions, confidence, and the candidates were judged whether they were contemptuous or scornful or rude or unnerved or off-kilter. In other words, it's like they're talking more about the emotional content than the content of what they actually said. Here's another way to think about this idea, as recently elaborated by sociologists at NYU, Lisa Dugan. Consider the feelings evoked, consider just the feelings evoked by Ayn Rand's novel Atlas Shrugged. Has anybody here read Ayn Rand's novel Atlas Shrugged? A few of you have. Older, I see the older folks. It's a long book. It's a pot boiler. It's a pot boiler, but it's a strange book. It's a book whose sales are second only to the Bible in the United States, and whose fervent followers famously include vice presidential candidate Paul Ryan. So what Lisa Dugan suggests is that we think about Ayn Rand and Ayn Rand's novels not in terms of their terrible writing or their cartoonish plot lines or their absurd empirical claims, but about the sort of images and the emotions that they evoke. There are highly sexualized and exciting portrayals in her novels of the entrepreneur, of the greed-obsessed entrepreneur. So Ayn Rand presents a contrast not just of political options, but of emotional personalities. On the one side, we have the staid and domesticated forces that support regulation, empathy, self-sacrifice. These are coded maternal and feminine, right? We talk about the nanny state. What is the nanny state? It is feminine. It is domesticated on the one side. On the other side, we have the arousal of a masculine rebel who lives by his creative wits, the collective be damned. So you have a kind of choice here between vanilla sex or transgression. And gender identity, pride, self-esteem, and the possibility of exhilaration are also at stake. So what would you choose? The point is that we need to expand our thinking about what rational judgment is, how rational judgment works. The Republicans may be banking on their capacity to mobilize feelings, even when their policy proposals make no rational sense in terms of the economic interests of the 99%, much less the 47%. And whites are not the only group susceptible to the appeal of American exceptionalism, nor to the masculinism of Randians who stride about asserting absolutes without apology or qualification. So this is my note to policy wonks. We need to think about our emotional lives and the ways in which our emotional lives also constitute a part of our self-interest. So with these ideas in mind, the idea that we do need to talk about race, but in more complicated and variegated ways, and the idea that we need to also consider the arena of public feelings, I want to turn to the issue of whiteness in particular, which is a racial topic that we probably have more trouble talking about than any other. What I've been interested in lately is noting the changing consciousness of white Americans about their own identities and the relation of whiteness to the United States of America, to our sense of what this nation is, has been, and will be. So what I'm interested in is thinking about whiteness in terms of subjectivity, feelings of inclusion or marginality, as well as facts about what is prompting the changes in identity and subjectivity. So let me start with the facts. White European Americans living in the United States will soon share an unprecedented experience of dropping below 50% of the population. Some say this will happen by 2050, others say 2042. So for the first time in its history, the United States will be a majority non-white nation. And this raises a number of questions. Will this make a difference to its foreign policy or its domestic policy? Will the non-white majority revise and correct the image of history of the United States and its role in the world in the history books, bringing slavery, genocide, colonialism, and imperialism out from the footnotes? And how will whites respond? Let's look first at the numbers. The predictions are based on facts such as the following. Between 2000 and 2010, the U.S. population increased by nearly 10%. We're now 308 million people. Latino and Asian numbers increased the most. Each group increased its numbers by 43%. But African Americans went up as well by 12%. Even the category of American Indian and Alaska Native jumped 18%. The white population lagged markedly behind, increasing only by 1%, losing 5 points of its market share in the overall population. So whites dropped from 69% in 2000 to 64% in 2010 during this one decade. But even this number is misleading because the category of white includes Arabs and North Africans, and some Latinos ascribed themselves as white, and some Latinos we know can pass, but most Latinos actually cannot pass. But the important point is that the confluence of factors leading to the loss of white majority cannot be corrected by changing our immigration rates. The majority of new Latinos, for example, are born in the United States. They're not immigrating here, they're born here. Now, some important caveats to this change. It's important to note that whites will remain the largest plurality even after 2050. They won't be a majority, but they'll be the largest group, the largest plurality. More importantly, the economic advantages in home equity and other forms of inherited capital, cultural capital and otherwise, wrought after hundreds of years, are likely to persist for many generations. The distribution of economic resources will not change as quickly as the demographics change, because as many studies have revealed for a number of years now, the way that race affects a household's economic condition is not based on wages, but in real estate. When the measure of wealth rather than wage income is used, it turns out that white families have 44 times more wealth than African American families. 44 times. It's because the wealth is in your home, and your home's wealth is dependent on what neighborhood you're in, et cetera, right? The recent mortgage crisis hit the newest and poorest homeowners the hardest, disproportionately people of color. United for a Fair Economy estimated that the subprime mortgage bubble that started in 2008 caused losses of between $146 billion to $190 billion for African Americans and Latino homeowners. So these facts, together with the liberal inheritance laws that we have in this country, mean that there will be a cross-generational payoff of white privilege for some time. But I would suggest that we have clear signs across the country that the likely longevity of material advantage is not enough to offset the psychic turmoil that has resulted from an impending loss of majority status. So I think I think white subjectivity is in ferment and in turmoil, and there's a generational shift, as Christine Kelly also noted with some of the statistics, and I think there's, you can sort of see signs of hysteria in the election, certainly. I don't think that this is merely a media orchestration. The media, as I said, is not even talking about race enough. I believe it's clear to most whites that things will not continue to operate in the future in quite the same way as they have operated in the past in this country. And Obama's presidency is kind of a powerful symbol of this change. And we can contrast this to the manufactured German hysteria about the imagined Jewish world domination. What we're experiencing in this country is not that. Jews in Germany were about 3%. They were not in danger of taking over. But the fear of losing white dominance is not merely a projection of paranoia or a manipulation by elites. Millions of urban whites in the United States have been experiencing minority status for decades. New York, Miami, Denver, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Houston, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., Detroit, Tampa, Baltimore, and Philadelphia are all major cities with a white minority. And there are now 4 states with minority white populations. So the absolute cultural and political hegemony of whiteness has already been lost. Even the Tea Party has to drag its non-white participants up to the front of every major public event. It's important to stress that whites are split over the Tea Party. According to a Newsweek poll in 2010, 45% of white Southerners disapprove of the Tea Party's negative politics. Fearful, racist, and violent responses by whites to their impending minority status are clearly not the only sort out there. What the opinion polls are showing is that there are significant divergences still between whites and non-whites on race-related matters, but I think sometimes we overlook the important data from such surveys. For example, according to recent Gallup polls, 56% of whites disapprove of the treatment of immigrants in the U.S. Fully half of whites believe racism is widespread, and 44% believe racism is a factor in the high rates of incarceration among African Americans. So in the post-civil rights era, white attitudes have changed significantly about issues such as neighborhood integration, interracial dating, and the significance of racism. While the disparity between non-whites and whites on racial issues can sometimes reach 40 percentage points, what I don't want us to overlook is the fact that nearly half of white Americans agree with the overwhelming majority of people of color on many political questions concerning race. Younger whites are no doubt the main game changer here. They have grown up in more diverse environments in their schools, neighborhoods, work sites with interactions that are often egalitarian, not simply interacting with servants. Many young whites gravitate towards strongly assertive forms of African American expressive cultural productions, from musicians to comedians, and even to some Latino cultural expressions. The support among white youth for Obama was well known, but white youth also populate the ranks of more progressive and social movements outside the electoral arena. Living amongst diversity, even when this occurs in fairly egalitarian conditions, though, is not sufficient to explain a decrease in racism, as Gordon Allport's study on racism showed many years ago. The contact zone between groups has to be of a certain sort. Take the comparison once again with Germany, in which Jews experienced much more integration than in other countries in Eastern Europe and Russia at the time, where pogroms made everyday living such a nightmare that the whole family sent away their children to other countries knowing that they would never return. That was what the conditions were like in Russia and Eastern Europe. In contrast, in Germany, Jews attended university, entered many other professions, owned property, and achieved a measure of cultural and economic success. But there was a general non-confrontational and pro-assimilation attitude among German Jews since the 19th century. When Karl Marx's family, for example, converted to Christianity so that his father could practice law. And this probably had to do with the extreme minority in Jews in Germany, 3 to 4% at most, right? They knew they were not going to contest the nation. They would always be a small minority, and so they probably held back. As a result, though, Gentile Germans in those historical periods were not confronted by the angry assertiveness of aggrieved Jewish sensibilities expressed in popular music or street demonstrations, nor did they experience the moral challenge of a civil rights movement that showcased the harrowing effects of social inequality and segregation. So Gentile Germans could live their lives in relative ignorance of Jewish perspectives about living in Germany or about anti-Semitism in Germany. So merely living alongside others, even in relations of relative equanimity, is insufficient to change consciousness. There has to also be an awareness of the other's point of view, including their assessments of the dominant group and the dominant culture, that is, the shared social world. Without an awareness of the subjectivity of the other, I think the other truly becomes something like Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, or a kind of object that Fanon described as a corporeal malediction, or what Lewis Gordon calls simply a form of absence. When you don't know the subject self of the other is simply, as Gordon calls it, a body without perspective. The meanings of identity are always relational. And there's a good book by Judy Rohrer on Haoles in Hawaii. It's called Haoles in Hawaii. Haole is the term in Hawaii for whites. And those are a group of whites who have been minoritized for longer than those on the mainland. And Rohrer traces the shifts in the meaning of Haole or white identity in relation to the shifting populations on the Hawaiian Islands, as well as shifts in colonial political economy and the labor market. So I think what her study shows, and what lots of studies show, is that whiteness cannot remain still while its social context is radically rearranging, however much it may try. Whites for some time, for example, in Hawaii, have been claiming victimization. They've been claiming this longer than some on the mainland. Rohrer reports, which is a claim that's an interesting fantasy in relation to the real-world facts about property ownership in Hawaii and wealth on the islands. But it also must be understood in relation to the minority numbers of whites and the powerful presence of non-white cultural traditions. The very idea of white supremacy is, of course, a relational claim. I'm superior to somebody, right? And I was struck by the discourse of both conventions, and that both, this is what drives me crazy, and I think a lot of people, I was born in Panama, drives many people crazy, is that the discourse of both made constant comparative demands and comparative claims, optimizing rather than aiming for the good. Why do we have to be America the best? Why can't we be America the good? Right? Why does it have to be the best democracy, the best country, the best economy? I mean, ask yourself that. Why can't we be happy with America the good? When you aim for the best, there's two things that follow. One, you don't even need to be good to be the best. If everyone else is portrayed as barbaric, you only need to be slightly less barbaric, right? And then you can still be the best. Second, when you're the best, you have less motivation to treat others in international politics with equality, to listen to what they say, to work on coalition, to work alongside them. If you're the best, you should lead. So this optimizing rhetoric positions the U.S. relationally in a way that has an impact on foreign policy. You know what I mean by optimizers. Some people are optimizers and some people aim for the good. This is an argument that I have with my husband all the time because he's an optimizer while I aim for the good. So he wants to go to the best restaurant and I just want to go to a good restaurant. And if it's one I've been to before and I liked it, it's fine. I want to go. But he wants to go to the best restaurant. It drives me crazy. But this is, part of, it's like hardwired into U.S. rhetoric. And if you don't, Obama, in a way I know, he has to say he's aiming for America the best. He can't not say that because this has to be part of the rhetoric of the United States. We really need to think twice about this. One strong reason for changing the subjectivity of whites, for the changing subjectivity of whites, which I think is a fact, is a result of their changed relational position then, as people who can no longer pretend to be unaware of the point of view of non-whites. Whiteness is no longer invisible, and whites are likely to feel self-conscious today in a great deal more public spaces, including many public schools and universities. I grew up in the South. I grew up in Florida. Half my family is white and half is Latina. I bet I'm not the only half-white person in this room. But in the South, people knew they were white. They always knew that they were white. There was no invisibility of whiteness. I always contested the sociologist's claim in this regard. But it has become more of a national phenomena now. There was a study by sociologist Charles Gallagher of college students in the 1990s. And he did a lot of surveys with white college students who evinced a palpably painful and confused sense of feeling white. One guy says, now I really have to think about it. Like now I feel white, unquote. Avoidance of thinking about one's whiteness is more difficult to maintain in segregated, it's more difficult to maintain in less segregated social landscapes where whites are a minority or a near minority, or at least not the overwhelming majority. The main catalyst of this developing self-awareness among whites that they are racialized subjects whose point of view on the world is only partial and limited comes thus, I want to argue, not from whites themselves, but from the increasingly visible points of view, sensibilities, opinions of non-whites who have for a long time seen the limitations of white points of view. Comedians, I think, have been some of the best educators and communicators of these contesting points of view. Both non-white, famous non-white comedians who we all watch of all racial groups and love, but also white comedians. You should also YouTube Stephen Colbert's Neutral Man's Burden. he did a kind of brilliant send-up of the whiteness equals neutrality, the idea that whiteness equals neutrality in judgment. So whiteness is in transition. It's not really becoming visible for the first time, I don't think, but its meaning is changing in ways that call white cultural dominance to account and white claims to neutrality into doubt. Whiteness was visible before, and I think you can't have a segregated society where whiteness is invisible. But its dominance was naturalized to such an extent that it required no justification, no commentary, no analysis. By contrast, the very presence of blackness or brownness or Asianness in some cases had to be justified in many public spaces such as university classrooms, while the presence of whiteness enjoyed an a priori justification. It's similar to what's happening now with gender. Now we have slightly more females than males in university classrooms, and all of a sudden there's all this talk about that. When we had like 75% males in university classrooms, it wasn't seen as a problem by the very same people who are seeing the gender of, and it's like 51, 52% across the country is now becoming a problem. So I think this is interesting. What is being lost, so much so that some whites may in fact feel today that their presence requires certain justifications in certain neighborhoods, for example, or at certain concerts, is the sense that white dominance is just sort of taken for granted. What's becoming more widely visible then is not whiteness, but white domination, we might call it. That is a hegemony of whiteness in public life. And this is what's fueling, I think, the ferment of white identity. Its lost sense of its unquestioned legitimacy and its sense of uncertainty about where this transitional national moment is leading. So this is the challenge for creating equality in this period, I want to suggest. We need to overcome the optimizing of American identity in the world and white identity in the United States as the best, or the center, or the greatest source of national ideas. Carving out a coalition, not just on economic issues, but in relation to cultural presence, whose history counts, how we tell the history, and what is our national sense of identity. And I think there's a lot of emotional resistance to this that we need to bring to the surface, name, understand, analyze, and show people. I remember watching Soledad O'Brien's series on race last year, on Latinos in particular, and she was interviewing these white churchgoers in a rural community whose church was filling up for the first time with Latinos. And there was this white woman who was actually crying. She was sitting there crying because of her intense feelings about the fact that she was going to church and hearing Spanish all around her that she couldn't understand. She felt outside of her own church. So whiteness, I think, poses unique challenges to the formation of a culturally pluralist, egalitarian society, to achieving equality, in which group identities can be present in the public sphere without rancor, without enforced assimilation, or without assuming we know stuff about each other before we even get to know each other. There is always going to be conflicts between various groups, but when conflicts arise among people of color, it's been possible to invoke the fact that people have shared histories of identity-based oppression as a common experience. So you can build a coalition based on a shared experience of historical exclusion and discrimination and economic exploitation, etc. Negotiating and managing the conflicts between oppressed racial and ethnic groups and whites poses different challenges. So the future equality of our nation will require us to address this topic head-on. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Martin Alcoff for this extremely thought-provoking talk. And I mean, we've all heard the cliche that the good is the enemy of the perfect, or the good is the enemy of the best. And this really brings us to, I mean, the way you outlined it has certainly put a different perspective to that cliche that we hear all the time. And I'm sure many in the audience have questions, comments, so I'd like to, there are microphones on either side of the auditorium, of the room, and just raise your hand and someone will walk a mic over to you. All right, we have a question right there from Christine.
Thank you, that was really interesting talk. I just have, I have two questions. One is, did you get a chance to see the PBS documentary before the debate, Race 2012? And just, if you have a take on it, okay, I think it's interesting. In your presentation of sort of white and then the ideology of white supremacy, I'm wondering, the complicated history of whiteness and the sort of fragile coalition of whiteness from a class perspective, and the power of white supremacy as a driving cultural force. When you talk about property ownership, the mean statistic, I think sometimes, disguises or makes invisible the incredibly fractured class lives of white people, and that in fact those who own the most, the 1% of whites, define whiteness. And is that something you've thought about? Because, as a professor who teaches at LIU, a friend of mine often says to his students, a very diverse group, he said, who came from a ethnic Jewish, cultural family, would say, white people are white so long, only when there are people of color in the room. And then they're Jewish or Italian or Irish or Polish, etc. So I'm wondering if those questions about whiteness are things you've explored.
Great questions. That's a great question, and yes, absolutely. I've thought about this a great deal. We can't talk about whites, en masse any more than we can talk about any other group, as we're learning. One of the class differences are huge to me, and I'm writing a book on whiteness, and what I mainly have in mind is the majority of whites who are working at Walmart, cafeteria ladies, going to war, not having a terribly great life. That's my family. I mean, the white part of my family were sharecroppers in South Carolina. My white mother actually picked cotton in South Carolina. So the reality of white people's economic interests, is a complicated story. But one of the things that I want to push back against some theorists is, and this is why I want to bring the emotion in, is that we can't just analyze the white vote in terms of the economic interest. I mean, there's all there is all this interesting work and discussion among political theorists and sociologists. Why do white workers vote for Romney? Vote Republican. Why don't they vote their economic interests? And I think that we have to think about self-interest in an expanded way. I do think that some of the white part of my family got a sense of pride and a sense of confidence. My grandfather learned to read and write when he was an adult, and I think he had the sort of wherewithal to do that. He had some confidence to do that, partly because of the white dominance in his neck of the woods in the South. So I think there's a payoff. I don't think it's, so in other words, I don't want to put the sphere of the emotion as in irrational. It's all irrational, it's myth, and then we have to talk about economic interest. No, I think we have rational interest to want to feel pride, to want to feel connected to a positive history, to want to feel at the center of our communities. So I think that all of those are at play. And we need to understand all of those at play for whites across the class divide. But I think we really need to look at the changing white consciousness, because if we're thinking about the future, and I'm thinking about the future of whiteness, and the future of how it will impact democratic politics in the United States, the attitudes and the comfort level and the sense of entitlement are all changing. I don't think we should rest easy that it's going to happen automatically, though. In Latin America, we don't have the one-drop rule. We don't have a binary racial system. We have what many people call colorism, which is it's all about how light you are. And so you still have a lot of racism and lightness dominance that's pretty extreme and ridiculous, even with a changing notion of what whiteness is and with colorism. We could have that in the United States. Some people suggest we could be moving toward a kind of colorism in which more people are let in, and that's already the research. Sandy Darity's this economist that's done some really interesting research. He's shown, I couldn't believe this. I know him, but I was had to read this twice to believe it. But he has shown that light-skinned African Americans' job rates are almost exactly the same as whites. But what that means is that if light-skinned people of color, blacks and Latinos, are doing pretty well the same as whites, then the other people of color are doing even worse than the statistics show. Right? So we have to disaggregate. We have to disaggregate Latinos and whites and Asians to get meaningful understanding. Absolutely. And I'm hopeful. I'm actually a hopeful person about the possibility of radical changes in white subjective consciousness in the future, because I do think that experience matters. I think a lot of us are a little mixed. I think the borders are becoming more permeable, people's experiences are changing, and so I am hopeful, but I don't want us to be naive about the challenges.
First of all, thank you so much for your lecture. Just constantly learning so much, and this election is just so very important. I have two questions. One question is, I'm interested in your views on the Electoral College and the connection between racial issues in this country and the continuance of the Electoral College. And my second question relates to democracy. In terms of certainly thinking that democracy is good, dare I say best. And I'm looking for better ways to talk with my students about the power of the Supreme Court in the context of democracy. So, okay, thank you.
Yes, the Electoral College has become a way to maintain white dominance. Because if you do a nationwide or even statewide vote, and you see pockets of non-white votes that are going one way, I mean, the Electoral College actually is I think in the last election it went against the popular vote, and I don't think that's the first time that it's went against the popular vote. Was it 2004? Okay, that it went against the popular vote. So, the Electoral College, historically, we know what the Founding Fathers had in mind. They had in mind of limiting, the effects of the suffrage. So one of the things I think is, that is really an important fight to make and is worth fighting for is expansion of the suffrage. Expansion of the franchise, we might call it, expansion of the franchise. That's what we've got to fight for. Felons who cannot vote, and that changes elections. That absolutely changes elections. In Florida, where I'm from, the questions of the voter suppression that's happening. Poor people, Latinos, many Latinos who are fearful of going to the polls because they've, Joe Arpaio, just in his county in Arizona, I just heard this morning, they sent around election informations to people in Spanish. It gives the wrong date. It gives November 8th in Spanish. It gives the right date in English, the wrong date in Spanish. I mean, we think, this is the kind of stuff that happens in other countries. It happens in our country. We need poll watchers from, I don't know, Cuba, Iceland, somewhere. We have some real challenges to whether or not we really are going to be able to maintain democracy or really have democracy and certainly expand democracy to what it should be. So the Electoral College is one fight. And that's huge. I don't know that we'll be able to win that fight anytime soon. We should abolish it. We should absolutely abolish it. I mean, it gets in the way of democracy. I mean, in my heart of hearts, I do not, well, not in my heart of hearts, in my brain, I don't believe the Republicans believe in democracy. They really don't. And you can see it very easily in everything they do and everything they say. They don't think the masses are smart enough to, it's like, and it's this notion of the president and his manager, right? That's what we saw in the most recent debate. Who's going to be the best manager of the society? You don't vote for your manager, in most employment situations, except in worker cooperatives, of which there are very few. You don't vote for your manager, right? I think it's this notion of the president as manager, and the manager knows more, sees the big picture, gets the security information. We're not in a position, they think, to make these kinds of judgments. And they keep us in that position of not being able to make those kinds of judgments. So I think there's a real creeping, I don't want to call it fascism. I know everybody, jumps to hyperboles. But there's a creeping lack of democracy, we might say, in the United States today. And I think it has a lot to do with white dominance, but not just about white dominance. It's also about class and the 1%. And these notions of technocracy and the president and leaders as managers is a kind of alibi that plays a role in that sense. And I think a lot of us do feel that way. I feel like that. I'm not a good numbers person. I had to read the numbers because I don't remember the numbers. I don't know all the stuff that, it's hard to keep up with all of the different issues that they're debating in the debates. So you can feel like, well, you can sort of go with your gut or listen to some people or read the newspaper that you particularly like and go with that, because I think they're counting on our lack of confidence in our judgment. They're counting on it. I don't think we should feel unconfident, because I don't think it's about choosing a manager who's got who knows the numbers in this. I think it's about choosing political direction. And your second question was about the Supreme Court. Yes. I know that there's this big debate now, and one of the things that is happening in the pushback against gay marriage is that the conservatives are saying this should be popular vote, this should not be the courts. The gay marriage advocates have been using the courts, have been saying it shouldn't be up to a vote. That justice shouldn't be up to a vote, which was something that we argued back in the civil rights movement, that, the southern states, if you took a vote, would not vote the right way. That's true. You needed a federal government intervention at certain points to make changes that needed to be changed. But there is this conflict between that and democracy. I think one way to think about that conflict is that sometimes you do need interventions from courts and from federal governments to safeguard democracy, to safeguard and to expand the franchise. So that's one way to think about it. That the interventions in the courts, okay, when they are, safeguarding our ability to be equal political participants. And I think homophobia does have an impact on people's ability to participate freely and openly in the civil and political domain. So that's one thing I would say about the court.
You had mentioned that there were included in the white, I guess, census statistics that there were a lot of Latinos who consider themselves white who can pass for white. As the white majority diminishes, do you think that these groups of Latinos, as well as other national groups that have kind of been absorbed into whiteness, will recapture their past national identities?
You mean because it'll be kind of safe to do so? Is that what you're thinking? I don't know. I mean, I think Latinos are different from any other ethnic group, and a lot of times the ethnic theory people drive me crazy because they assume, that like Germans and Italians and Irish became white, and that this is what's going to happen to other groups. It's certainly not the case. Asians and African Americans are more obviously visibly different, and Latinos run the gamut. So there's not always a visible difference among Latinos, but the Guatemalan day laborers who stand out on Lexington Avenue on my way to work, waiting every morning for work, they can't pass. Most Latinos cannot pass. So I think what's mostly different about the Latino population in the United States is that we're living in the Western Hemisphere. I feel like saying hello sometimes to U.S. politicians. I mean, Mexico is our neighbor. More people speak Spanish in this hemisphere than anybody else. Miami is a majority Spanish-speaking, what they call Miami is, the capital of Latin America. And the joke about Miami is that what's best about Miami is that it's so close to the United States. I mean, it's easy for Latinos to go home. It's easy for Latinos to maintain ties, and many do. And it's much harder for other immigrant groups to do that. They cut ties. They don't get to visit. And certainly enslaved people's ties were forcibly cut. So there is this ongoing connection. And most people I know, read the news online from their home countries and follow events. Some people have dual citizenship and even vote. So I don't think we can predict that there will be this gradual lessening of attachment to home countries. I think that what you're suggesting is right, that there may be a maintenance of the identification. And I think also it is becoming a little safer to do so. When my sister and I came to the United States when we were little kids, speaking only Spanish, and she was flunked out of school. She was school age. I wasn't yet, but she was flunked out of school. She was put in a special needs classroom because she spoke only Spanish. And so my mother stopped speaking English to us. So there was this trend in the 60s of assimilate. You have to assimilate as much as possible in order to survive in this country. And I think there's kind of a reverse assimilation going on with this younger generation, that it's become more acceptable to have Spanish and to have a visible cultural presence. So I hope that trend will continue. And nobody that I know advocates that we should just speak only Spanish. Everybody wants their kids to be bilingual. So it's not about either or, but it is about maintaining a visible presence and an integrated identity in which all parts of yourself can be a part of who you are publicly. Now, you all don't have to agree. I'm interested in... This is a big topic, so I'm just throwing out possible ideas. And if you disagree, I very much welcome.
I just want to know, when you think the American paradigm will shift where race becomes a non-factor?
You mean when we achieve post-racialism? Well, I'm not sure we ever will, in truth. Because the way in which I think about these questions of racial and ethnic identity, and they are connected, not easy to really disconnect them, is that they are about history. So they are about a sense of collective memory of history. And history doesn't go away, right? The level of racism in your society can change, but your tie to a certain history isn't going to change. So you're tied to peoples who were enslaved, or whose land was annexed, or who experienced colonialism, or who experienced attempts at genocide, as Native Americans experienced in this country. That's going to stay, and that's going to continue to affect your interpretation of the textbooks that you get, in school, and your interpretation of electoral arena, rhetoric. So in that sense, I don't think we're going to become post-identity ever. I think, but the mixing makes a difference, I mean, what's happened with white people, and the reason why whiteness has become a stronger issue than Italian and German identity. In regard to that, I think that what's clear is that like Mary Waters was a Harvard sociologist that wrote a book about white ethnics, in which she was arguing that the upsurge of white ethnic identification in the 1960s was the result of, it was kind of like an opportunist move. So blacks and Latinos and Puerto Ricans and Dominicans had their march down Fifth Avenue, so they wanted the Irish, the St. Patrick's Day parade and different things. So they asserted a certain white ethnic identity to be comparable to. And I think that's true for some, but I don't think that's true for all. There are communities in Syracuse, New York, of Irish whites who have been continuous since they came over. And they've intermarried, and if you go to those neighborhoods, the green light is at the top and the red light is at the bottom, the stoplights. I mean, they're Irish identified out of the continuity of tradition. So there is that sector of whites who are ethnically identified. But there's also a lot of whites that their ethnicities intermarried so much that they're European. They're not really, just Italian anymore, just German anymore. And so then you have this amorphous, but still, I think, contentful idea of white identity and a certain history of whiteness, which means that, you were positioned in a certain way and you were interpolated, you were invoked, you were talked about in a certain way in the discourse of this country. And you have that history to share, plus a lineage to Europe. So I don't think history is going to go away, even though the way in which we think about each other, understand each other, treat each other, I hope, will radically change.
We have time for one more question or two, if we keep them brief. Go ahead, sir. Yes. And then Jenny.
I really enjoyed your talk a lot, and I think you're right to talk about emotions, right, and the importance of emotions. What I'm wondering is, in your research, have you found particular kinds of emotional reactions to being the lack of white dominance, right? And why I raise this point is that you could think of a continuum, right, where you could have anger, you could have frustration, and people, to frustration respond differently than they do to anger, right? Frustration is often seen as a lack of freedom, right? Where anger very often is seen as, being put upon or imposed upon, right? And very often can lead to things like violence, right? Where frustration doesn't always do so. Mm-hmm. So have you read anything by social psychologists that suggests how whites as a group are responding?
Yes, I mean, there's a little work. It's mostly piecemeal, not sort of global. I think that there's a total range of responses. It's not one response. Some you can work with. Some responses you can work with, like feelings of powerlessness. I think the frustration is connected to a feeling of powerlessness. The country's changing, and I'm having no input, and I'm losing my economic position, and I don't know what's going to happen. So that is the sort of thing that you can work with, whereas other things I think are harder to work with. So there is a big range, but I think what unites the range is this ferment. This kind of people are thinking about it. People are maybe not overtly in the public domain, but there is this ferment, and there is. There's certainly, you can look at it culturally in terms of the popularity of hip hop. There's something going on there that I think is complicated. I think it's admiration for me. Like we admired R&B when I was growing up, but it's more than that because hip hop is different from R&B. Some R&B was political, but a lot of hip hop is like very assertive. It's sometimes aggressive, but it's very assertive. And it's assertive of a particular point of view and a particular social position. And so the fact that whites are, listening to that, thinking about that, identifying with that is interesting. I think sometimes it's been dismissed as, white wannabes kind of thing. But I don't think that's just what's going on. I think it's also about trying to figure out how to live differently in their communities and how to be differently in their communities. And seeing where the action is, and culturally and politically, and wanting to be a part of that, not necessarily as the leader, but as alongside. So I think that's cause for hope.
Janine, I know you have a question, but just before I take your question, I know that some of our students have to possibly move on to the other campus or to go to their next scheduled event. So please join me in applauding our keynote speaker, and we'll still be in the room.